Welcome once again to our discussion on principles of economics. And in our last class, we are discussing about inflation, and that was actually the topic what we last topic what I intended to cover in this particular course. So, in inflation, basically, we learned what is the mechanism by which excess money supply can actually uh, uh, create inflation. That means what is the mechanism by which excess money supply raises the general price level. And then we also learned about the relationship between money supply, value of money, and inflation using a money demand and money supply diagram. And then we also learned about cost of inflation. Okay, so basically at towards the end we were discussing about uh, inflation tax, shoe leather cost, menu cost, so on and so forth about inflation. Just before I uh, talk about today's discussion, I would just like to elaborate little more on the inflation tax and shoe leather cost. Basically, when we keep money in our wallet idle, so regarding that shoe leather cost and inflation tax, basically when we hold money in our wallet instead of keeping or depositing to bank, what happens is we lose interest rate that we could earn from the bank. So that is one cost of money holding. There is another cost which is called inflation tax. For example, if there is inflation, then every time my money will be losing its value. 100 rupee may become worth of 90 if there is inflation tomorrow. So that means inflation acts like a tax. So to minimize that inflation tax, if we deposit all my liquid cash in bank, then what will happen? To maintain my day-to-day transaction demand, every time I need to go to either ATM or bank, right? So that is that will in that process I have to spend a lot of my time and energy. And metaphorically, we can say that if I make too many trips to bank or ATMs, then my bottom part of my shoes will actually have a uh, uh, what I will say that there would be some kind of uh, uh, depreciation in that leather. So my that is why in Bengali and Hindi we call it मेरा जूता का जो सूख तला होता है ना जो सूख तला will खोड़ा. So the bottom part of my shoes will get depreciated in the process of making too many trips to bank and ATMs. If for every transaction I need to collect cash from the bank, so that means we need to optimally hold money. So that is why the cost of inflation is basically this. So at one hand, if you hold money, then you are going to lose your interest and you are going to have less value of your money. That acts like an inflation tax. If you want to avoid that inflation tax, then what we need to do, we need to deposit all our cash to the banks, and in that case whenever I need some cash, some money for my transaction purposes, I need to make a trip to bank or ATM. Of course, in today's world, when you have GPay, Paytm, PhonePe and all these things, that concept may not be, the idea of that shoe leather cost may not be so applicable. But assuming a situation at least couple of years back when we used to do most of our transaction by liquid cash, and economists they developed that concept at that point of time that we must keep some cash in our hand to meet our transaction demand, but too much of cash holding also will lead to loss in interest rate, interest income and loss in the value of the money, and depositing all my cash in the bank also will lead to Shuleder cost. So, with this we ended our discussion on entire micro and macro modules, and then my plan is now to discuss with you some important application oriented questions from all the topics we have covered, so that you will come to know how to apply the principles of economics, the concepts we learned in an empirical, in an applied world, to solve many application oriented problems that will refresh your previous understanding and also give you an idea about application of economic principles. So, first question that we are going to discuss: technological improvements in agriculture that shifts the supply curve for agricultural commodities to the right tend to, there are four options given: reduce the total revenue of the farmers as a whole, because the demand for food produced by those farmers is inelastic; reduce in total revenue for farmers because the demand is elastic; increase in total revenue of the farmers as the food is inelastic; and increase in total revenue as demand for food is elastic. So, to solve this question, firstly we need to know what will happen to the price. Since the question is related to elasticity, we need to find out what is happening to the price, then only we can relate it to total revenue, because we learned that price changes and elasticity basically relates change in price with change in demand, and therefore change in total revenue. So, let us first try to understand what will happen to the price. So, technological progress means, let us say that this is the demand, this is price, this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve, this is, let us say, D1, this is S1, and this is your equilibrium price and quantity to start with. And then you have what you have done, you got technological improvements that will shift the supply curve to the right. So, supply curve is shifting rightward from S1 to S2. So, obviously what is happening, quantity demand is increasing, then there is a fall in price. So, price is falling. Obviously, when there is more supply, price will fall, quantity demand and supply will increase, right. So, the question is then, what is the relationship between delta P and this delta Q? So, depending on the magnitude of this delta P and delta Q, I will get to know what will happen to my total revenue, right, because elasticity is basically change in total quantity demand with respect to change in price. Now, agricultural product or food items, elasticity of food item is inelastic in nature. For example, you take rice, or you take wheat, or you take tomato or potato or corn. So, even if price changes, we will demand little more, but since it is a necessary product, we cannot eat more than what we want, right. So, therefore, most of the agricultural product, elasticity of demand for agricultural product is less than 1, that means inelastic in nature. So, that means what I can say, that delta Q by Q is actually less than delta P by P. Okay. So, that means let us say that price falls by 10%, then the increase in quantity demand would be less than 10%, let us say 7%. And then what will happen to total revenue? You can easily understand the total revenue will fall. So, that means we can say that first of all there is a reduction in total revenue, okay, and what is the reason? The reason is the demand for food is inelastic in nature. So, that is how we need to apply our concepts, what we have learned so far, to solve this type of application oriented questions. Okay, you understood? This is, you need to first analyze what will happen to the price, and then related to the price, law of demand says that there is inverse relationship. When there is a fall in price, demand for the product will increase, but whether it will increase proportionately, less than proportionately, or more than proportionately, that depends on the nature of the good. And food items or agricultural products are inelastic in nature. You need to understand that, because we cannot consume more than our capacity, right? So, this is the first question. So, there would be a reduction in total revenue due to the fact that price will fall, quantity demand will increase less than proportionately. So, this particular application shows how to apply demand, supply, shift in supply curve, and then the concept of elasticity to total revenue. Now, come to the second question. Necessity of studying economics originates from the fact that efficient allocation of resources, demand and supply, money, international trade, scarcity of resources. So, apparently you may feel that necessity of economics, basically, as I said, the major objective of economics is to allocate resources efficiently. So, obviously, you may feel that efficient allocation of resources is the prime reason for which we study economics. But that answer is wrong, is not correct, because why do you need to allocate resources efficiently? So, what we assume that resources are limited, but we have unlimited demand. Suppose we have unlimited resources, then there is no question of efficient allocation of resources. If something is abundant, unlimited, then why should I bother about efficient allocation? So, that means resources are scarce. So, that is why scarcity of resources actually is the main reason for studying economics, because that only calls for efficient allocation of resources. Therefore, we need to study economics. If there is no scarcity, no need of studying economics, because whether it is efficient or inefficient, I do not care. Whenever I need, I will spend money or time or energy, material, whatever. So, that means the necessity of studying economics originates from the fact that scarcity of resources. Other options, demand and supply, yeah, this is a tool we need to apply, but that is not the prime reason to study economics. Neither is the money, because money is not the only resources. Okay, apart from money, there are many other resources. International trade is also one aspect of economics, not the only one. Then come to question number 3, which says, which is inconsistent with an elastic demand curve, right? So, elastic demand curve means elasticity is greater than 1. So, that means delta Q by Q divided by delta P by P is greater than 1. Okay, if let us say this is elasticity, this is greater than 1. So, that means if something is greater than 1, obviously that should be, let us say elasticity is 2, okay, something greater than 1, or let us say 1.5. So, that means the elasticity coefficient is fractional. If it is fractional, let us say 3/4, that is less than 1, or 2/3, again less than 1, or 1/3. These are all less than 1. So, the moment I say elasticity is fractional, that means it is not greater than 1. So, that is why the inconsistency is here, the elasticity coefficient is fractional. What will happen? The second option, total revenue falls when prices rise. Okay, for an elastic demand curve, if prices rise, then quantity demand will fall more than proportionately. So that means if that quantity demand falls more than proportionately, then what will happen? Total revenue will fall. So that is true. That means B is not inconsistent. You understand what I am saying? Total revenue will definitely fall because for an elastic demand, delta Q by Q is greater than, from here itself what I can write, that delta Q by Q is greater than delta P by P. So, if this is, let us say 10%, then for elastic demand this will become, let us say 15%. For 10% rise in price, quantity demand will fall more than proportionately. Obviously, what will happen? Total revenue will fall. So, there is no inconsistency there. Buyers are relatively sensitive to price changes. Yes, that is also true. For when I am saying elasticity is greater than 1, elastic demand means there are many other alternatives available. So, obviously, buyers are relatively sensitive to price changes. Relative change in quantity exceeds relative change in price. That is a fact. The moment I say greater than 1, look, I have already derived that delta Q by Q, relative change in quantity, is greater than delta P by P, relative change in price. Okay. All right. This is our example number 3. Then this is another interesting question. Look at the diagram carefully. This is again a diagram of demand and supply, and then equilibrium, price and quantity. All right. So, initially it was 8 and price was 8 and quantity demand was 10 units. Now, when there is a tax imposed, then what happens? If you recall, that imposition of tax creates some kind of differential between the price paid by the buyer and price received by the seller. Before imposition of tax, price paid by the buyer, that means this is basically price paid by the buyer, PB equals to PS equals to 8. There is absolutely no difference, there is no distortion in the market. Okay. In absence of any distortion in the market, price paid by the buyer is exactly the price received by the seller. But when there is a tax imposed, this PB, price paid by the buyer, becomes greater than the equilibrium price, and this is, let us say, I am telling about equilibrium price, which was there earlier, and price paid by the seller would be less than what they were receiving earlier. So, from this diagram then you have to think which is PB and which is PS. As I said, PB should be greater than the equilibrium price. You can easily understand in this diagram, then PB is basically this price 11. So, this is equals to 11. And what is PS? PS is actually 5. Okay. So, that means the government has imposed a tax, and what is the tax amount? From the diagram, if you recall, the difference between PB minus PS is the tax amount that we have discussed. Post taxation, if you take the difference between PB and PS, that is the tax amount. So, out of this tax amount P, how much is the consumer sharing? Basically, the consumer part is PB minus P star, that is the consumer bearing, consumer is bearing consumer's part of tax burden. How much is the seller bearing? PS, sorry, P star minus PS is the producer's part. So, that means from here we can understand PB minus PS is 3. That is the amount the consumer is paying post taxation, and then how much is the quantity? How much is the quantity that the consumer is buying post taxation? Quantity is 3. So, obviously, the tax burden, the total amount of tax paid by the consumer is 3 into 7 equals to 21. Okay, that is the part consumer is paying, consumers pay. And how much is the producers paying? Okay, how much is the producers paying? See, here it is 3, and again the difference between PS and P star and PS is also 3, and therefore both are actually sharing equally 50-50. But it may so happen that either producers can pay more or consumers can pay more. That means, as we have discussed earlier, incidence of taxation, the sharing of tax burden depends on the relative slope of the demand and supply. The way this particular diagram is drawn, the tax burden is shared equally 50-50. Therefore, P star minus PS is also equals to 3. So, both of them are sharing equally, but do not get misguided that it is always the case. No, we have discussed already. So, you have to carefully recall and keep in your mind that even though in this particular diagram we see that both the consumer and the producer are sharing that burden of tax equally, this is only a specific case. The way we have drawn our demand and supply, the slope of demand and supply is so specific that in this particular case only they are sharing the tax burden equally. But if you make this demand curve little flatter, then what will happen? You will see the consumer's burden will go down, because making the demand curve little flatter, keeping supply same, means you are making consumers little more elastic compared to the producers. More elastic means more responsive to a price change. Obviously, consumer will bear less burden of taxation compared to the producers. In that case, producers will share more than this. Anyway, this is only one example where we see that burden of tax is shared 50-50 between consumer and the seller. And then we have also learned, even though this question is not asked here, if I ask you what is the deadweight loss here in this diagram, can you tell me what is the deadweight loss and what is the tax revenue? So, deadweight loss is basically this one, this particular small triangle is the deadweight loss. Okay, what is the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus by definition area above the price line below the demand curve. So, obviously this is your consumer surplus. What is the producer surplus? This one. This area, producer surplus. Okay. And what is the government revenue, total revenue out of taxation, tax revenue? This is called tax revenue. This rectangle, this is called tax revenue. And what is the source of this deadweight loss? If you recall, the deadweight loss is arising because when the tax is imposed, price will go up, as a result of which some consumers will leave the market and remaining consumers will buy less. So, that is one source of deadweight loss. So, that means basically this particular segment is a loss from the consumer side, because some consumer they left and existing customers they are buying less. Similarly, from the producer side, when the price falls, some producers will find the price after taxation less attractive. Therefore, some of them will leave, existing sellers will supply less. That is the reason this amount. This is from the producer side, both of them combining together forming the deadweight loss. So, that means a part of consumer surplus which is not going to government's pocket as tax revenue, a part of producer surplus which is also not going to the government's pocket as tax revenue. These are the two sources of deadweight loss. That is what we understood. So, this is another application of our concept of demand, supply, taxation and then deadweight loss. You have to relate it in this way. So, then let us move on to the next question. In the diagram below, the demand curve D1 and the D2 they are parallel. What does it mean? Slope of these two demand curves are same. Therefore, we can conclude that price elasticity of demand, these are the following option. Option A is not determinable from the information given. Okay. So, given this information, price elasticity of demand cannot be determined. So, do you think so? That whether we cannot a particular point, let us say A on the demand curve. So, what is A? A is basically the at point A, how do you define elasticity of demand? dP dQ or let us say from the elasticity of demand, it is basically delta Q by Q divided by delta P by P. So, it is dQ dP into P by Q. So, there are two components we know. So, this is basically slope, inverse of the slope rather, inverse of the slope of the demand curve, and this is price quantity ratio. So, we know the slope, we know the price and quantity also. So, using this we can, this I will say inverse of the slope. So, first option is not true. Then second option is elasticity of demand is equal at point A and B. So, some of you will be tempted to answer this, since the demand curves are parallel, obviously slope are equal, and equal slope means equal elasticity, but that is not the answer. See, slope is only one component of the elasticity. What is the other component? P by Q, price quantity ratio. Now, if you calculate P by Q ratio here, let us say this is your Q1, this is Q2, and Q1 greater than Q2, but P is same. So, obviously P by Q1 at A at point A and P by Q, if you compare P by Q ratio at B, which is P by Q2 at B, what is happening? Can you tell me P by Q1 and P by Q2 whether they are equal or not? So, you can easily understand, since Q2 is greater than Q1, P by Q2 obviously would be less than P by Q1. If you are increasing quantity, then price quantity ratio will fall. So, as a result of which we can say that this is greater than this. So, that means, since this is greater than this, elasticity at point A cannot be equal to elasticity at point B. Okay. So, at point A it is less than point B, that is the, since this is more, okay, P by Q is actually P by Q is more than P by Q at B, then what I can say that elasticity at point A is less than elasticity at point B. Sorry, I think I made a mistake. See, this is P by Q ratio. So, P by Q ratio is actually more here. So, elasticity at point A is greater than elasticity at point B. So, this is more. P by Q ratio is more here because Q2 is more at point B. So, therefore, if you multiply, slope is same, but P by Q ratio is more at point A, that is why elasticity at point A is greater than the elasticity of point B. So, this is another example, another application. You must keep in mind that the moment you see the demand curves are parallel, it is a natural tendency to say that elasticity would be same, but that is not the case always. Okay. Then the next question is, consumers will bear a larger burden of a unit tax if the tax is imposed on the consumers than on firms. Both demand and supply are relatively elastic. Demand is relatively elastic and supply is relatively inelastic. Demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. Both demand and supply are relatively inelastic. Okay. So, from the theory of taxation, what we have learned, that if you recall, we discussed first a case where tax is imposed on the buyer, then we discussed a case where tax is imposed on the sellers, but then we proved that it does not actually matter on whom the tax is imposed, the end result is going to be the same. So that means sharing of taxation does not depend on whom the tax is imposed, rather it depends on, as I mentioned just now, it depends on the relative slope of the demand and supply. Based on that, we need to answer this question. So the first option is the tax is imposed on consumers than the firms. That is not true, because it does not depend on whom the tax is imposed. Both demand and supply are relatively elastic. So if both are elastic, then also we can't say who is bearing how much of the tax burden. Demand is inelastic. Third option is demand is relatively elastic, supply is inelastic. So if demand is elastic, that means consumers, they can respond to the taxation, they can avoid market participation. Either they will switch to some other product or they will not buy. So that means if that is the case, consumers will not bear a larger burden because they are avoiding. No? So fourth option, demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. In that context, since demand is now inelastic, consumers, they have less options available to them when there is an increase in price for a product. Maybe the nature of the product is such that the consumers don't have enough alternatives available in the market. Okay? And the consumers cannot stay away from market participation. So what will happen in that case? In that case, we will see that consumers will bear a larger burden of unit tax compared to the producers. So this example, option 4, option D, demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. Okay. Now the question number 6, that is a question on production possibility frontier. Okay. So you may recall production possibility frontier, let us say we have two commodities X and Y. Then the production possibility frontier, it basically indicates that different combination of the two goods that the economy can produce from the given amount of resources and technology. So that means since resources are limited, we cannot produce more of both the commodities. If we want to produce more of Y, we have to sacrifice production of X. If we want to produce more of X, we have to sacrifice some of Y production. For example, let us say this is computer and this is wheat. So more wheat production requires less of computer production, more computer production requires less of wheat production. There is a trade-off. Okay, there is a trade-off. People face trade-offs. Economy is facing a trade-off between the two commodities, and slope of the production possibility frontier, we say that indicates, if we recall quickly, slope of the production possibility frontier indicates the opportunity cost. Okay, opportunity cost of computer in terms of wheat. And we mentioned that there are two types of production possibility frontier, either this or this. Okay, both are PPF. This is also PPF. Let us say PPF 1. And this is also a PPF, which is PPF, let us say 2. And we also learn that PPF1, when there is a straight line, what does it indicate? Since slope of the PPF is constant in a straight line, we say that opportunity cost is same across the production possibility frontier. So that can happen when we can substitute one commodity for the other at a constant rate. But what is happening in the bow-shaped PPF? The slope is going actually down. Okay, slope is going down. So that means, if you recall, we said that when the laborers are equally skilled or homogeneous in their skill, then only there is a possibility that we will transform or we will sacrifice wheat for computer at a constant rate along the PPF. Otherwise, what will happen if there is heterogeneity? For example, let us say you have initially employed all your laborers for wheat production. In that labor force, you have computer engineer, you have farmers, right? So, if you release some amount of laborers, you have to sacrifice some amount of wheat production. So, initially let us say you have sacrificed some farmers. So, the farmers were contributing more. So, obviously what will happen? Sorry, let us say you are transforming your laborers from here to there, you have employed all wheat production. See, slope is less here and more here. So, when you are shifting from here to here, look at this, the transformation is very less, but when you are coming here, then the shift is sacrifice you are making in terms of Y production is very large. Why this is so? Initially you have employed all your laborers for wheat production. Now when you are releasing your labor, initially maybe you are asking the engineers to go for computer production. Obviously those engineers were anyway not producing much of wheat, so your sacrifice in wheat production is less. But once you have released all your computer engineers from wheat production to this, now you are asking the farmers also to come down for computer production. As a result of which, you will sacrifice more wheat production to get one piece of extra computer. Anyway, this is the idea of production possibility frontier, but the question is different. Let me come back to the question. So, the question is, when you have this type of production possibility frontier, this is y, sorry, this is x, this is y, and this is your PPF. So, a shift in production possibility frontier means what? If you recall, we said that any point on the production possibility frontier indicates efficient production, any point below the production possibility frontier is inefficient, any point above the production possibility frontier is non-attainable, because production possibility frontier means a boundary, that is the maximum you can produce given your inputs and technology. But a shift in production possibility frontier means now you are able to produce more of both the commodities because there is a technological progress. So, technology which we have assumed earlier as given, now it has improved. So, obviously, when there is advancement in technology, from the given input bundle, the economy will be able to produce more of wheat and more of computer. Okay? Therefore, a shift in production possibility frontier indicates technological progress, not improved resource use efficiency. Improved resource use efficiency means movement towards the frontier. So, catching up. You are earlier you were here, which was an inefficient production plan. Now you are moving towards the frontier. So, improved resource use efficiency. cannot be reduction in resource use efficiency, because now you are producing more from the given input bundle. So, your efficiency might have definitely improved. Higher availability of resources, no, resources are given, rather higher availability of technological progress is only indicated by the shift in production possibility frontier. Now, there is another interest, then let us come back to question number 7. This is another interesting question. Let us read the question carefully. Jack always spends rupees 300 for petrol irrespective of petrol price. Okay, whenever Jack goes for filling petrol, you might have also observed many customers, when you go for petrol bunk for filling petrol, people are coming and then they are asking how much petrol, they are saying you give 300 rupees petrol. So, Jack is one such customers who goes to the petrol bunk and then ask for 300 rupees of petrol irrespective of the petrol price. So, the question is whether this is the question is his demand for petrol is inelastic, elastic or unitary elastic. Okay? Inelastic, elastic, unitary elastic, perfectly inelastic or perfectly elastic, that is the question. So, that means, let us say initially you have price for petrol was 100 rupees, P equals to 100, right, P equals to 100, and your total expenditure for petrol is 300, that means your quantity was 3 liter. So, that is why total expenditure equals to 300, alright. Now, you have a price, next day when Jack goes to the petrol bunk, he sees that P equals to, let us say, rupees 150. So, that means there is a 50% increase in price, 50% increase in price. So, what should be the new Q2? Q2, so that his expenditure for petrol is still 300, that is the question. So, when the price goes up, obviously Jack has to reduce its demand for petrol. So, how much you will reduce so that your expenditure can remain still 300? So, obviously when it is 150, 50% increase, so that means you should, instead of buying 3 liters of petrol, you will buy only 2 liters of petrol. So, earlier you were buying 3 liters and then you are buying uh, 2 liters. So, then you are having the P into Q is still now 300. Okay. All right. So, that means my change in price earlier it was 100, now it is 50, 150. right? So, earlier I was buying 3 liters of petrol, and now how much should be my petrol, so that quantity, so that I can have the same 300 rupees quantity. So, when expenditure is same, so that means your delta P by P and delta Q by Q, what should be the ratio? So, I must reduce my petrol demand. I must reduce my petrol demand proportionately. Then only I can maintain my expenditure as same. Okay. Right. So, a 50% reduction in price must be compensated with a 50% reduction in quantity demanded, then only you can maintain the same same expenditure that you were doing earlier. Okay. So, that means delta Q by Q must be equals to delta P by P. Otherwise, what will happen? If your demand for petrol reduced more than proportionately, when price is increasing 10%, you are reducing by your petrol demand by 15%. What will happen? Your expenditure will go down, because P into Q. So, if it is, when it is inelastic, then your expenditure for petrol will go down. If it is inelastic, price goes by 10%, but you are not able to reduce your petrol by 10%, you are reducing petrol, let us say, by 7%. Obviously, total expenditure for your petrol will go up. Okay. When it is unitary elastic, 10% increase in price and 10% reduction in quantity demand will keep the expenditure same. So, obviously, it should be unitary elastic. Okay. It should be unitary elastic, that should be the answer. So, next question is, if the tax rate doubles, the deadweight loss increases by 2 times, increases by 4 times, increases by 3 times, decreases by 2 times, and decreases by 4 times. So, this particular question, that means there is a relationship between tax rate and deadweight loss. We need to remember that. Then only we will be able to answer this question. You remember when we discussed about tax, deadweight loss and tax revenue, there is a relationship. Okay, what is the relationship of tax revenue and deadweight loss? Tax revenue and tax rate and deadweight loss, tax rate and deadweight loss. So, there are two specific relationships we have discussed. So, please go through that relationship once again, and then we will come back to question number 8 in our tomorrow's session, along with some more applications.